How do you know something is scary? Fear is defined as an unpleasant emotion caused by the belief that someone, or something, is dangerous, likely to cause pain, or a threat. So, as a result, people have different definitions for what makes something scary. Some people find jump scares scary, some people find a cool monster design to be scary, and some people find the mere implication of something scary happening to be frightening. Now, all of these are very reasonable, but for me personally, I find something scary when it is able to leave an impact in my mind. Not only when it initially happens, but also for a period of days, weeks, or even months following my initial exposure to it. Every piece of horror media that I've become attached to over the years has maintained a level of fear in me long after I was initially exposed to it. And this is exactly what happened to me with the topic of today's video. Now, if you're at all interested in the analog horror genre like I am, or hell, if you've clicked on the video, which, hi there by the way, you know about a video called the Boiled One phenomenon. This is a video that I personally really enjoy, with it genuinely being one of the scariest bits of analog horror I've seen in a bit, not only through the actual content of the video, but also on a more conceptual and personal level. So today, I want to talk a little bit about what works, what doesn't work, and why I personally find it very scary. Also, I just wanted to give a quick thank you to everybody who has helped me reach 6,000 subscribers in the last week. It's a goal that I never thought I'd reach in a million years, so thank you all very much. If you'd like to support me at all when the video is done, make sure to leave a like or subscribe, and join our Discord server if you're interested in chit-chatting and keeping up to date. Anyways, in order to talk about why it's scary, I think it's important that we first talk about
let's be financially responsible! I can't stop winning! I can't stop winning! I can't stop.
The Boiled One phenomenon is a roughly 10-minute video that portrays a government tape of a TV hijacking that took place in the year of our Lord and Savior 2003. The video starts off listing safe practices for enjoying the tape, such as keeping a Bible open to Psalms 91:10 and having some earplugs near you, among some other grounding practices. We get a couple details for the background of the hijacking, such as that it took place during a rerun of a cancelled nature documentary. We then get to watch a little bit of the nature documentary before it gets interrupted by one of the most absolutely horrific visuals I have ever seen in my entire goddamn life. But we'll get there when we get there. This thing, referred to as PHEN-228, which I'm going to be calling PHEN for short, speaks in reverse, which is apparently a feature the government put into the tape for our safety. So thank you, government. If you reverse the message, you'll hear PHEN state that merely seeing his face was enough to manifest him, and that he will be keeping a close eye on us even if nobody else will know he is. However, what we get to see now is a mere glimpse of its full message. But what we do learn is that following PHEN's little valedictorian speech, 509 people were paralyzed by a condition called locked-in syndrome, doomed to a fate of what can be compared to constant sleep paralysis, with PHEN lingering nearby at all times, and the sounds of endless screams and trumpets echoing throughout the distance. Thankfully, we get to hear PHEN's diss track in full when he so rudely interrupts the tape following an interview with one of his victims, known as Job Zamperini. PHEN proceeds to prophesize about how we will bear witness to the events prophesied in the book of Revelation. He describes the events in Revelation as a joyous day, one in which the scalding blood of life will be poured onto us, one that we will all lie still for, mentioning a feast before he is cut off. We are warned that what we have viewed is long past what is considered safe, and that we should do the grounding methods from the beginning of the video before it promptly ends. It is a very well put together video in my opinion, and one that has very adequately freaked me out recently. But before I touch on that, I want to get what doesn't really work for me out of the way. That way I can focus on the good for the rest of the video.
Hey, James from Idaho. A little birdie told me it's your birthday today.
While I personally really enjoy the Boiled One phenomenon, it is certainly not exempt from the tropes of the analog horror genre as a whole. If you want a video talking about the good and bad of the analog horror genre, by the way, here's one of mine. Go check it out if you're interested. Anyways, plug aside, the Boiled One phenomenon is honestly a pretty generic analog horror video. In terms of analog horror, it's a fairly by-the-books government announcement / cover-up story, which is already pretty common and features elements of a hijacking, the end of the world in some sense, and is another universe where a bastardization of Christianity exists, even if it is reasonable in the circumstance. It's stuff that's been done before, and in some instances it's been done a lot better, and while I personally like it, I can see why it can be a deal breaker for somebody who may be interested in this. I've also heard complaints about the voice acting, but I personally thought it was fine. I'll gladly take it instead of having to hear the damn Mandela Catalog Volume 1 text-to-speech voice that I've heard about 20,000 times at this point. Also, it's a tiny bit of a side tangent, but in the interview section, I personally think the text on the live, laugh, love thing above Zamperini's bed frame is just the tiniest bit cheesy, but that's more or less just a nitpick than anything. But back to my first point, for a lot of people this seems to be just a pretty generic analog horror project with a really good monster design, and that is where it stops for them. If that is all this is to you, then I can understand why people might not like it as much as I do. However, with all of that out of the way, I want to talk about what works for me and why I personally just can't stop thinking about this little horror video over 2 months after watching it.
Man, I don't know what to think no more. Man, get out of my head.
Holy shit. I think it goes without saying that Phen is an incredibly freaky and well put together monster design. Easily the most striking thing about the video on a surface level is the design of Phen. I know it was absolutely the thing that caught my attention, and it's to the point where after watching the video for the first time, I had pretty vivid nightmares about it, which doesn't really happen very often for me with horror media. Hell, even now when I'm trying to sleep, I can sometimes see Phen peering through my eyelids. It's a very surreal thing to experience, punctuated even further for me through my own experiences with night terrors and sleep paralysis when I was younger. My absolute favorite shot of the video is this one, purely because it reminds me of my times experiencing sleep paralysis, having to sit idly by as something I'm not familiar with stares at me from the corner of my room. While a lot of the time what I would see was just a silhouette of something usually vaguely humanoid, Phen looks like a pretty recurring figure from those bouts of mine. It's an incredibly striking design in my opinion, and one that I think was always destined to be pretty scary judging by some of the concept art for it. Now, I've heard a lot of people, specifically on like fucking Reddit, taking issues with the title of the video being the boiled one phenomenon, saying it's irrelevant to the video. But I mean, look at the dude. He looks like somebody tried to sous vide him for a while and just kind of forgot about him for a couple of years. And while it can be hard to hear, I want you to pay attention to this line from Mr. Phen here.
The standing blood of life will pour down onto us all.
The name, the boiled one phenomenon, is no coincidence. I've also heard complaints about the monster design, stating that it falls into the whole Germa sus face thingy that the Mandela catalog popularized, but I don't really find that to be the case. Just because Phen happens to have a scary face doesn't mean that he belongs with the 20 billion doppelganger clones that are so popular elsewhere. I know that it's a pretty subjective thing, so you're entitled to your own thoughts about it. I just personally happen to think that he's delightfully scary looking. Now, while at a surface level, the video is pretty scary as a whole, in my opinion, the scariest part about it for me is when you get a little bit outside of the box.
Sounds like someone breaking in.
While I had my girlfriend over a couple days ago, we were watching a video of mine and we were talking a bit about what makes the whole VHS look that analog horror has adopted so scary. She made an excellent point, one that I could never really put into words, but it was something that I had been thinking the whole time. That being that the appeal of the VHS filter in analog horror is not only just for the sake of having a charming and unique visual style, but also the true scare factor of it comes from the at-home nature of it. I personally grew up on the tail end of VHS tapes being used as a medium, and while people were still using those big chunky box TVs. And as such, this aesthetic is one that feels very strangely nostalgic for me. If you're older than me, which is not very hard, I can only imagine that the effect of this is only amplified further. But when you use the VHS medium in modern analog horror, it taps into a fear that I think we all subconsciously have. That being that a time you consider to be safe, in this case the leisurely act of watching television, can be invaded and ultimately detrimental to your very existence. While a cognito-hazardous being like Phen is pretty out of the realm of our existence right now, the more generalized fear of having your safety invaded is what makes settings like being alone in the woods, standing near the edge of a mountain, or being home alone so scary. It's not the environments themselves that are particularly scary, at least not intentionally, but rather the thought of some external force invading that safety and causing you to experience a sense of peril. As such, the boiled one phenomenon capitalizes on this fear, planting a ticking time bomb in an otherwise innocent nature documentary. While all of this was itself enough to leave a lasting impression on me, if you've been paying any attention at all, you will notice the boiled one phenomenon's connection to Christianity. But what may not be so obvious is Phen's connection to figures present in World War II, which leads me into our next topic of interest.
Pam, we need to take this to the grave. We cannot tell anybody. This changes literally this changes everything.
Before we can talk about the religious aspect of the boiled one phenomenon, which I think is really cool and scary, I need to tackle something first that I personally think is interesting, but could also be a problem for a story like this. That being the boiled one's connections to World War II, specifically two men, Mutsuhiro Watanabe and Louis Zamperini. Now, if you've done any deeper digging into this video and the creator behind it, you'll know that the boiled one was surprisingly inspired pretty heavily by the Japanese war criminal Mutsuhiro Watanabe, who became infamous for his treatment of prisoners at the Amori POW camp in Naoetsu. Arguably his most famous prisoner was Louis Zamperini, an American World War II veteran and Olympic athlete, who would later recount the brutal punishments he underwent as a result of Watanabe's influence, and his subsequent subsequent journey to healing afterward by incorporating Christianity into his lifestyle. It's a story that's pretty cool on its own and has some pretty cool implications for the story of the Boiled One phenomenon so far, but I feel like these references currently work better as just allusions rather than Zamperini and Watanabe being actual characters in the story. Could the Boiled One truly be a manifestation of all of the pain and suffering that Watanabe caused, returning to torment Zamperini once more through the very thing that helped him ease his suffering in the first place? I suppose maybe, but honestly, I don't really fuck with the use of real people in horror if it isn't handled well, so we'll just have to keep an eye on it for now. I'm sure that Dr. Nowhere knows what he's doing, but it is a topic that requires some sensitivity in handling it. Otherwise, it's a pretty neat bit of history trivia and a cool illusion if that is the case. It's also worth mentioning that the nature documentary in the Boiled One phenomenon makes reference to the Tree of Heaven, which we'll touch more on later, coming from Taiwan and China. If you're at all familiar with the various atrocities committed by Japan leading up to and during World War II, this shouldn't really need too much explanation, so I'm just not going to mention it because if I say anything about it, YouTube will fucking nuke me.
By helping the evil devil, you confronted your own problems.
Anyways, tangent aside, while I do think the original story definitely just straight up featured Watanabe as its villain, as the original designs for Phen previously looked a lot more human-like, the final design of Phen contains one key difference from its previous design that completely changes the meaning of the story in my opinion. Something that even Dr. Nowhere hinted at on his Twitter page. If you take a look at the finalized design of Phen, you'll notice what appears to be an array of thorns or needles adorn the top of his head. While previously this would have been a set of thin, greasy hair, it seems to be an allusion to the crown of thorns that Jesus was forced to wear in the days leading up to his crucifixion.
Smaller animals like insects, rabbits, and birds can afford to have a lot of babies at once, while larger species like whales, elephants, and rhinos are much slower to reproduce. The Ender Dragon.
Now, if you think that's a bit of a stretch, just hear me out, as that's not the only bit of biblical allusions that we see in this video. First and foremost, the name PHEN-228 may be a reference to a number of verses in the Bible, but I think the one most befitting of this specific circumstance comes from Joel 2:28. And it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my spirit upon all flesh, and your sons and your daughters shall prophesy, your old men shall dream dreams, your young men shall see visions. This definitely isn't coincidental, as this verse connects to a couple of events in the Boiled One. A pretty big chunk of what Phen is prophesizing in his little mixtape is with regards to a scalding blood of life that will be poured down onto us all. We'll have to come back to that in a second though, as it has much bigger implications. The second half of this verse refers to old men seeing dreams and young men seeing visions. This is something present in the video as well, seeing as Zamperini's grandkid took a picture of Phen, unaware of its presence in the photo prior to it being taken, and Zamperini reports hearing trumpets right before he falls asleep. The young man has a vision, and the old man is stuck in a never-ending nightmare. It's pretty cool in my opinion. But wait, there's more. While there are a couple of very literal Bible references in the Boiled One phenomenon, such as Psalms 91:10 and the Bible being open as a part of the safety measures when watching the tape, as well as the nature documentary host incorrectly referring to the poison oak tree as the Tree of Heaven, the most striking and interesting ones come from the ending of the video. During the end of the video, we hear 6 trumpets sound in the distance during Phen's monologue. Alongside the visuals and mention of scalding blood pouring out of the sky. If you're familiar with the book of Revelation, you'll know that following the 7 trumpets being sounded comes several plagues and disasters upon humanity, signifying that we may already be too late. The scalding blood that Phen mentions refers to the pouring of the 7 bowls, unleashing God's wrath upon the people who had the mark of the beast, creating a sea of scorching hot blood. Arguably the most important part of this video is the Boiled One's connections to the Antichrist or the false prophet mentioned in Revelation, I'm not really sure which one. Referring back to Phen's apparent crown of thorns, it can be inferred that Phen is trying to appear holy in some sort of sense. He parades around a crown of thorns and seems to be preaching the word of God, albeit with ulterior motives, having multiple mentions of some sort of feast. In my opinion, I think it is very likely that Phen is the Antichrist. Now, what is the relevance of all of this? Well, in my opinion, it is not only very interesting, but it is also an extremely horrifying concept to me. Referring back to what makes the VHS filter and other seemingly innocuous things seem scary despite a lack of malicious intent, when you have something that can be safe and comforting for many people, like the Bible, and you have a monster that is effectively weaponizing it for the sake of its own ulterior motives, it conjures up the image in my mind that truly nothing is safe from its influence. While I don't actively rely on the Bible for comfort now, when I was younger, I would spend my time being grounded reading through the Bible to pass the time. And even with something like the events in Revelation, which can be a pretty inherently scary concept in and of itself, there was at least the relief that this was all a part of God's plan. But to hear the words of God twisted into a mockery of what they once were, used by a creature hiding behind God's good intent, masquerading as a prophet to harm as many people as possible with the very thing that brings them comfort, this is a concept that plagues me even in spite of not being Christian anymore. In my mind, Phen is the ultimate representation of just how scary it can be for someone, or something, to intrude upon a safe space with the most horrible of intent. Whether it be relaxing in bed trying to close your eyes, watching TV, or indulging in religious material, Phen is ultimately the breeze that is just barely strong enough to snuff out the candle's light. While yes, Phen is powerful, as seen through his abilities to put people into pseudo-comas and masquerading as some sort of being with divine knowledge, Phen's true power comes from the eternal suffering and discomfort he is willing to put people through in order to spread the message about his feast, thus increasing his influence in the process. So while many people are willing to dismiss the boiled one phenomenon as yet another piece of analog horror with nothing but a scary face to carry it, it is a piece of media that has genuinely plagued my mind for these last couple of months, even carrying over into my dreams. So whether or not you do find this scary is ultimately up to you, but perhaps if you're willing to dig a little deeper, you may discover something you would have been a lot happier not knowing. Anyways, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and subscribe, and comment any thoughts you have, as it helps me out a ton. If you're interested in chit-chatting and staying up to date, we have a Discord server in the link in the description below, so come and join us if you'd like to. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching, and have a great rest of your day. Bye bye!